Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Shaken Not Burned. I am your co-host Giulia Bottaro, and I'm joined today by Mike Penrose, the co-founder at FuturePlus and the Sustainability Group. Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Why don't we start with you telling me a little bit about what you do and your expertise?
Yes, so at the Sustainability Group, our core product is FuturePlus, and FuturePlus is a sort of sustainability and ESG management and improvement system. It allows you to report and do all the other stuff that certain reporting systems does, but predominantly it's a management and improvement system. And it's one of the only systems that we've ever come across that allows you to quantify and measure your intent as well as just what you've done in the past. And for us, that's absolutely essential, because when you're only looking at previous sustainability actions, sometimes only in a narrow band, like, for example, carbon, it drives all the incentives towards trying to retrofit data on previously unsustainable practices into modern sustainability frameworks. If you allow people to benchmark where they are, but put most of the incentives towards being ambitious and measuring what it is they want to do and moving forward, then it drives all the incentives towards that ambition, towards continuous change. And we also look at sustainability in a much broader sense than most. So we look at, because we believe there's a huge amount of interconnectedness between different aspects of ESG and sustainability. So we look at climate and we look at the environment, but we separate the two because they are two distinct things. But we also look at diversity and inclusion, economic and social indicators. And we do that because, for example, a lot of the most critical issues when it comes to diversity and inclusion are actually down to socioeconomic factors. A lot of the ability of people's staff and individuals to engage in the fight against climate is also socioeconomic. And as we're seeing today, when the world becomes socially more volatile, the attention shifts away from climate. But the two are interconnected, as we're seeing in the wildfires in California today. So we look at it in a very broad sense. We allow people to benchmark where they are, but we drive all the incentives towards looking forward and benchmarking where they want to be. And third, critically, then we give them the help to get there. And that's another thing we think is relatively unique in our system. We don't just ask you to tell us what you've done and where you want to be, but we help you get there as well. And we've done it in a way that works for finance markets. We've done IPOs, but we also work, about half of our customers are what we call super micro or micro companies, very, very small ones. And that ability to measure your intent is also critical, because quite often startups, they're being asked by investors and banks, what have you done in terms of sustainability? And they're going, well, not much. We've only existed for 3 weeks or 6 months or et cetera. But we allow them to go, this is what we intend to do. And here are our financial projections alongside our commitment to sustainability. But my expertise, my background, I'm the former CEO of UNICEF in the UK. Before that, I was the CEO of Action contre la faim, Action Against Hunger, one of France's biggest socially focused not-for-profits in international development. But I was also on the ESG advisory committee of the London Stock Exchange, the FTSE for Good, previously. And previously, I worked with a group called the SDSN, Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which was set up by the economist Jeff Sachs to design the indicators that underpin the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Amazing. Wow, what a career. Thank you for sharing that. And sounds like you're the perfect guest to discuss today's topic, which is the business case for sustainability. So to start off easy, why should businesses have a sustainability strategy at all?
Actually, it's probably the question we get asked the most. And it's one of the reasons why, to start maybe a bit controversially, I'm pushing quite hard now to stop just using the words sustainability and ESG.
Okay.
Because what it does is it puts it outside of core business. It makes it part of something they should be doing to be good. But when you've got investors breathing down your neck and salaries to pay, the core business is making money. Sustainability is what you should do alongside that. And I think I'm a big believer that we need to reposition sustainability and ESG into core business in the way that it's about finding efficiencies. It's about making your business more efficient. And if you become more efficient from an energy perspective, from a transport perspective, you will lower your carbon emissions. If you become more effective from a resource use perspective, you will lower your costs. If you look at the diversity and inclusion and socioeconomic situation of your staff and tailor yourself around that, you will have a more loyal workforce, and it costs more to recruit a staff member than it does to retain one. So for me, that the reason that people should put it in place is the same reason they would have a risk register. It's the same reason they have an investment plan. It's the same reason they look at all of their business management systems, because it's about efficiency. It's about creating a more sustainable business in terms of longevity. It's about making your business more resilient. And we did a lot of research that shows that businesses that focus on sustainability tend to be better at weathering global insecurity, global uncertainty. They tend to last longer, purely because they're taking a longer perspective. They're thinking about 5-10-year plans. They're thinking about reduction of carbon emissions by 2050. They're thinking about recruitment plans 2, 3, 4 years down the line, which you have to when you're looking at the most suitable workforce for the areas in which you're operating. And that perspective means that they are thinking about the way the world is going, and they are more likely to have a better plan in place. So if you start thinking about sustainability in terms of efficient, resilient, sustainable businesses, and sustainable not just in a carbon sense, but just in terms of existence, then the business case becomes very clear. There are also lots of other things we've come across now. We did a debt refinancing deal for quite a large hospitality firm, and ended up getting them pretty much £1 million reduction in costs for servicing that debt. It was a £400 million debt, but £1 million reduction, because they could provide the type of indicators that the finance markets wanted to see in terms of that long-term perspective. And we've also, as I said, we've done IPOs where we've been put at the top of the IPO offering and our sort of measurements on these things, because things like understanding of economic, social, and climate change and carbon are so essential to making people confident that your business is going to be there for the long term.
So if you're advocating for including sustainability as part of your business, then, I asked about a sustainability strategy. Does it mean that there isn't a sustainability strategy and then sustainability is weaved into the rest of the strategy, or you would still have a separate sort of plan?
I think it's important that you isolate aspects of. I take you back and we've talked about this a little before. The way even the word sustainability and things like this means different things to different people. I like to look at it in the literal sense. It is making your business sustainable. It fit for purpose for the long term. I think you do need specific plans when you look at the aspects that we measure. You need a climate and carbon. You need a plan for your environmental footprint and your environmental declarations. You need a plan for I'm more of a fan of the word inclusion than I am diversity. If you have an inclusive organization, then diversity takes care of itself and you can adapt better to context. But you need a plan to have an appropriate and structured workforce. You need a plan for your socioeconomic footprint. So you do need those individual aspects, but those should be almost annexes to the core business. It should, the integral part of what you're trying to do should be about building efficiencies into your manufacturing processes or operational processes. It should be about getting the right people for the right job. And harking back a little bit to your question, there's so much evidence, for example, in diversity and inclusion now, that if you have a broader range of profiles in your workforce, you end up with better decisions because you have different perspectives being brought to the table. There's such a clear business case for having not only the sort of individual plans around sustainability, but also weaving it in, making it an integral part of everything you do, your operations, your hiring and recruitment, your advertising and marketing, your operational protocols, your SOPs, as some people call them. So yeah, I think you need a sustainability plan as an annex to your core business plan, but then weave it all the way through, because it will save you money. You will get better employees. You will look better to your public. You will get better terms when it comes to credit and finance. So it needs to be at the center.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier ESG. So could you clarify the difference between ESG and sustainability?
They're sort of interchangeable terms to me. I think, and this is one of the reasons why sometimes I err towards moving away from using the terms other than sustainability in its most literal sense, a long preserved or a business fit for long preservation. ESG is a term that I think the finance industry has coined in order to have an acronym that means, do you have plans around social and environmental things? And is it weaved into the governance and therefore the fabric of your organization, environmental, social, and governance? Sustainability is often used just in terms of carbon, but it shouldn't be. It should be, as I said, the most literal sense. A sustainable business is one that you can sustain for the long term. And the literal definition when it comes to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, is maximizing your ability to profit or operate in the present without compromising on your ability and the planet's ability to do so in the future. And that's, I think, a better way of looking at it. But they're fairly interchangeable and most people use them liberally in both senses. I think if we go back to talking about core business, risk management, efficiency, and etc., it's more likely to normalize it into the fabric of an organization.
Yeah. I think ESG is more a sort of a risk framework, right? A way to calculate risk. As you mentioned, it's more using the financial side of things. While in my head, sustainability is more sort of an umbrella term for everything, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything that we talk about, which we need. We need a term that immediately puts you in that mindset. So imagine that we have a company that's been around for a while and has never thought about the sustainability side of things, which doesn't mean that they haven't never put in place certain plans, but they just haven't thought about it in this sense that we are thinking about it. So if they were to start a plan, a strategy, how would it affect their activities in the short, medium, and long term?
I think in all three of them, it has a positive effect immediately. So in the short term, it focuses people's minds on how you do things. So, but a lot of people, it sounds a bit trite and flippant, but we find so often in business when we go in and we help people look at their sustainability, they suddenly realize they're doing far more of what's considered sustainable practices than they thought they were. They're just doing it in little pockets around the organization. And they suddenly start to realize that, as I keep repeating, it's just about tightening up the bolts of your machine. It's about making your machine more efficient, more effective. So in the short term, normally what they'll find is it acts like any good business process evaluation that you'll go through. You might get one of the big four. If it's a larger firm, one of the big four in to do it. If it's a smaller one, a business consultant in to do it. It's about looking at the whole organization. They find very quickly that they get a better understanding of which bits of your machine are operating well and which bits are a little bit loose and need fine tuning. In the medium term and then into the longer term, what they'll probably find is that they become more efficient, that their processes are improved. They'll also find, I think, that if they're going out for investment or they're going out for credit or things like this, that they start getting either more favorable terms or an easier ride. Because again, it's something that, as I've said from the outset, shows that you're thinking about how your business works. And in the longer term, particularly if they're looking at growth, we found now that this is a factor in the valuation of businesses when they go to IPO or for bigger sales, large private equity sales, IPOs in New York or London or elsewhere. They look at this very, very closely. But I think what flows all the way through, if you continually keep reevaluating sustainability. And that's what we do at FuturePlus. We allow you to benchmark where you are, then benchmark where you want to be. But it's a moving feast. As you move forward, your goals continue to move forward with you because it's an ever-evolving process. It becomes a very effective way of identifying, particularly in the short term, where your business is operating well, where you thought about all the aspects you need to look at and repeating them again. What is my climate footprint? What also is my environmental footprint? How much waste am I producing? How much water am I using? What am I doing about any management of any byproducts of whatever it is I'm doing? What's the social impact I'm having in the communities in which I sell to, in which I operate, and which I source from? And the final one is, I think, particularly in the medium term, sometimes in the short, particularly if you're operating in the European Union, you will suddenly find that you are much more compliant and it's much easier to report to all of the burgeoning legislation that's coming out at the moment. And there's a phrase that a lot of people developing the legislation use, which is data maturity, which goes to also why organizations should start thinking about it now, because if they're suddenly told that they need to report within 1 year on something, they're going to be expected to report on several years worth of previous fragments of data or segments of data in a short period of time. So the reason they need to start thinking about it now is because they get that data maturity. And I find, and this is one thing, if I could shake every chief sustainability officer and say that it's that the biggest complaint we hear is, I'm spending all my time reporting to frameworks. It's really easy to report to frameworks if you're doing things sustainably. it's very hard to report to frameworks if you're not doing things sustainably, but you're asked to translate that data into a framework. So you wouldn't have to spend all of your time reporting and gathering data to report if you're doing it properly or using systems like FuturePlus, etc. You could spend all your time on making your processes more sustainable. And that, I think, in the short and medium term, if they start to really pull all the information into one place, focus on where they want to be, focus on what it is they're doing, and make themselves data mature in that regard, then reporting is as easy as pressing a button. Or, well, a little bit more than that, but it's not particularly difficult. And then you have so much time to start looking at actually how it is you do things and how you can improve your organization.
So what is the problem with these chief sustainability officers that you mentioned, that they spend all the time trying to report against the frameworks? Is it because the company maybe doesn't give them enough power to enact actual change? Is it like a focus issue?
I think it can be a variety of things. The most common things we see is we all end up like this sometimes. It's a sort of chasing your tail because the data hasn't been collected in the past. You end up just starting to report immediately and constantly trying to find the same bits of information. It actually does make sense sometimes to say, look, stop. We're going to spend 3 months putting all of this into a framework that can be applied across the board globally, and then start reporting. I know sometimes there's regulatory pressure, but normally if you talk to them reasonably, they'll be reasonable. But I also do think that there has been a bit of habit in the past of, my business partner Alex always jokes that, some of the people we come across was somebody doing a completely different job, but was carrying a sustainable coffee mug, and the board go, we need a sustainability officer. Oh, you'll do. And
Great.
It doesn't mean that they're not qualified, doesn't mean that they can't learn and they can't do it. But it's been a knee-jerk reaction so far. And going back to my very first point, boards and leadership teams sometimes aren't seeing it as core business. They're seeing it as an additional obligation. So they're just appointing someone to make that obligation go away. And then that person ends up stuck because they don't have the power to go in and go, right, I need to see all parts of the business and how we operate. So they do get very stuck in this reporting. So I think if I could shake people harder, it would be boards and leadership teams, and say, this is about core business, and your chief sustainability officer needs to be in every conversation alongside your chief finance officer and your chief operations officer. Or that role needs to be shared between those two people, because it is about how you allocate your money, how your resources are applied, how you do business, and this type of thing. Just putting someone in the corner and saying, there are some brilliant chief sustainability officers out there. There's many of them are doing a fantastic job. But I think you're right in the fact that they are told to do it separate to the work of the COO and the CFO. And it needs to be either hand in hand or embedded in those functions.
Yeah, I've heard that to see whether a company is serious about sustainability, you need to see whether the CSO reports to the CEO or reports to somebody else, right?
Yeah. CFO, COO is a good indicator. Reporting to communications, things like this. Sometimes there's some great people that do, but sometimes that does ring a little bell that the principal objective of the company is to talk about what they're doing, not necessarily change the way they're doing things. So I think it's really important that principally we're finding more and more those that take it seriously. It is a function that sits within finance, because a bit like when you run government, and having worked for government in the past, actually most of the power sits with Treasury, because they're the ones that say, right, you're getting this amount of money and you're getting this amount of money. And if it sits at that level and at the right hand or directly either to the CEO or the chief finance officer or the chief operations officer, then it means that the thinking around how resources are applied has sustainability baked into it. If it's many tiers down, resources get allocated, and then people are trying to say, right, how do I make this budget expand to fit the requirements that's coming from sustainability reporting?
Going back to the regulations that you mentioned earlier, which ones are the main ones, globally or, in the jurisdictions that you work in, and when are they coming into effect?
So you've got, particularly within the EU, and I'll probably get some of the acronyms wrong because there's so many acronyms and I always interchange them all. The CSDR and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directives within the EU are probably the most comprehensive at the moment. If I'm honest, I would say they're a classic bit of bureaucracy, which means they've been compiled quickly using multiple stakeholders, so they're very confusing at the moment. But I understand within the EU at the moment, there is a real drive to simplify them down and make them easier to apply and use, which is very important. But they're probably the furthest forward in terms of any legislation at the moment. The UK is following suit at the moment, and the UK, we will expect aspects of it to be coming in over this next Parliament. Obviously after the election, there was some very clear commitments made around climate change and the Social Values Act in the UK. We're finding more and more UK companies are talking about it because it's under this government, it will become very important how you actually measure the social value of your organisation alongside the financial value. And particularly if you're going for government contracts or you're working for companies that work for government, you're going to be expected to identify your impact indicators on social value and put them in. The US is a bit up in the air at the moment. Let's see in 2 weeks' time what happens. But what we found in the US is actually it's as much to do with the states as it is to do with the federal government. So in the past, California and some of the other ones have enacted much stricter rules. And so I think in the US, you'll see it piecemeal. There will be directives at a state level. And depending on how progressive the state is, that's where you'll see the legislation coming in. And elsewhere around the world, it's sort of dribs and drabs are coming in. But one of the problems with legislation as it's being applied at the moment is it's not looking at things holistically. There is just legislation coming in on carbon, SFDR, SECR in the UK, for example. And that's great. But if you have a myopic focus on carbon, then you tend to forget about all of the other factors that contribute to your carbon footprint, that contribute to everything we've just been talking about. Carbon's really important to reduce, but do we want a carbon-free world that is socially unequal, where environmentally we've devastated things because most of it's done through offsets, where we're not looking at our water consumption, where our waste is out of control? It might be low carbon, that we might be able to stem a little bit of climate change, but what else are we doing to the planet? And I think taking a more holistic view is the way things need to go. I'm still, given all the flux, the potential, the elections that have happened in Europe, Europe's not looking particularly cohesive at the moment on legislation. The UK obviously is still in a bit of flux, the US too. So I think it's a little bit of hope for the best, but prepare for not necessarily the worst, but a little bit of uncertainty in terms of legislation. But just based on what I was saying there, I think there's a really important, when you're thinking about creating legislation or applying to it, a sort of philosophical point to make. One of the things that annoys me most in the sustainability debate is people who say, well, we need this legislation because we're destroying the planet. Because that focuses things on the abstract, focuses things on something that most people feel is outside of their control. We're not destroying the planet. The planet's absolutely fine. In about 100 million years, which in a planetary terms is 10 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, the planet will be completely recovered from anything we could possibly do to it now. The only question is whether we'll still be on it, whether life on Earth exists as it does today. It will adapt, evolution adapt. But if you refocus both your attitude to legislation and building sustainability into that, then it suddenly becomes about us. It doesn't become about saving the planet or some abstract concept. It becomes about saving ourselves, creating a future and an environment and a society that we want to live in, one that's fit for our children. And I think within the legislative frameworks of people creating them, start thinking about how climate reacts with social, reacts with economic, we'll start creating better frameworks than potentially exist at the moment, which can be either very convoluted and confusing or very narrow in their framing of things.
Yeah, and even if these regulations are forcing companies to be sustainable effectively, and that's sort of their point, it doesn't mean that companies that want to take action now can't do it. In fact, they really should.
Well, they should, but back to my first point, they should because it's good for them. They'll become more efficient. They'll keep their staff longer. They will. All of this is proven. They will save money. They will reduce their outgoings. They will look better to customers. They will have tighter, more efficient processes. It is my master's degree is in risk management, and risk 20 years ago was considered like sustainability is now. It's something you did separately. Sometimes people wanted it. Now it is core to every business. And it's core to every business and demanded by every financial institution and by markets and etc. Because what it does is it makes you think about how your business operates, how you work, why you do things, what the potential threats are to you in the future. Sustainability is no different. It's exactly the same thing. It is, why are you doing things? What are the threats to you in the future? What are the threats to your operations? And it's difficult. I think businesses in California and around LA today would be hard pressed to argue that a focus on risk management or climate risk management isn't absolutely essential, as are businesses in the Gulf of Mexico, as are businesses in the north of England that have just been flooded. This is just risk management, and it's risk management, but with a much better focus on what is absolutely integral to business: your staff, the societies in which you live in, your ability to operate in the future, and the risks you face from the greatest threats at the moment, which is climatic and environmental.
So even if the politics changes all the time, you mentioned the Trump administration, which will be completely different from the Biden administration. If a company sets a sustainability strategy, it doesn't mean that they should change it based on what's happening around them, right? It's more about what they do.
Exactly. Don't get distracted. Governments will come, governments will go, we will be populist, we will be less populist. You see these waves happening all throughout history. Actually, markets tend to operate. They react a bit to changing governments, but they operate independently. And this is why I think groups and structures like finance and people who are the ones allocating capital are the ones more likely to affect change than government policy and legislation, because there's an old adage that we came up with and we use a lot, and that's that real change occurs when two factors are met: when consumers demand it and when capitalists condition upon it. Because if those two factors are met within business, if your customers want it and your money is dependent on it, you're going to do it. You can be the most cynical climate denier on the planet. If those two factors are there, you will do what is required. And I think if we look at it like that and really look more to the allocators of capital and to influencing public opinion on these things, and stop worrying so much about whether it's the Biden administration or the Trump administration or Brexit or the Labour government now, or whether Le Pen's going to get in France or etc., and start focusing on that this makes good business sense. Finance wants it because it means you're more efficient and more likely to survive. Your customers need it. Your customers demand it. Your staff want it. It becomes a no-brainer. It just becomes, like risk management is now, an essential part of what you do every day.
So going back to the sustainability strategy that we mentioned before, what are the drawbacks? We only mentioned benefits so far.
It depends how you view it. Some people say the drawbacks is it costs a bit of money in the short term, but you don't say the same about an insurance policy. You just go, yeah, got to do it. But the benefits of insurance policy is if the wildfires hit or something, your business survives. And you see this very much. I think if you look at it in the right way, there are very few drawbacks. If you look at it in the wrong way as another burden, then yes, it can take time. And initially it can take a little bit of investment, but so does every change of business process. If you look at it in the medium term and look at it in terms of return on investment, it's actually a very, very efficient and good thing to do. I think sometimes as well, people get a little startled by it because like anything that's new and it is relatively complex, looking at those 5 core aspects, it can seem a little daunting and overwhelming. I think one of the biggest phrases we hear a lot is, it's taking my attention away from what I need to do for my core business. But again, I keep repeating, but if you look at it in a different way, it's actually not. It's focusing your attention on the bits of your core business that need the most attention, which is down to how you operate, how your staff operate, and what it is that you do. So sound a bit dry, but there aren't that many drawbacks if you think about it in the right downsides. If you think about it in the right way, if you think about it in terms of being something you'll kick down the road because it's taking you away from core business, it will get harder and it will get more expensive and it will get more complex the longer you wait. We find that retrofitting sustainable practices to very, very established unsustainable practices costs a fortune. If you start conceptualizing it from the beginning and building it in, it doesn't cost much at all.
So if you are a new company, you really should put it in the core business now rather than even in 2 years' time.
2-3 years. If you try and wait for legislation to tell you, and you don't have that data maturity, you're going to spend an awful lot of money on consultants coming in, desperately unpicking everything in order to reframe it so you can report. I also think, and it isn't in place now, but history shows to us that it will become inevitable. Various penalties, taxations, things like this. The way that most governments work is they know some of the very, very biggest companies work to government because obviously that's where the biggest pots of money are. And so they apply legislation, first of all, to those big companies. And the smaller ones think, oh, it doesn't apply to me. But those smaller ones work to the big ones. And all the big ones do is cascade the obligation down onto the smaller ones, which is tricky. But when that legislation is proven to work, government then applies it further down. So take carbon emissions reporting. Yep, at the moment, it's only very big firms that are expected to do it. But mark my words, when Scope 3 emission reporting becomes an obligation, what will happen is that the government will apply the scope 3 to the very big firms and push the scopes 1 and 2 down onto all firms. It becomes a cascade. So anything that is being conceptualized now for big firms, small firms need to assume that it will be applied to them within 3 to 5 years. So they need to start looking at it.
Also, the scope 3 emissions of the big firms are the scope 1 and 2 of the smaller firms. So no one is safe.
No, exactly that. And this is where I find, again, a lot of the bigger firms will say yes to government when they ask them to do something and just pass the obligation down, because, every big contract to the government is normally backed up by thousands of small SMEs who are doing aspects of what it is that they've been contracted to do.
And I suppose another thing about weaving sustainability into your core business is that you're not going to do it in 2025 and then you don't think about it anymore. It's sort of a continued change in mindset sort of thing, right?
It is. And this is a very good point, because this is why I think, there are many badges of sustainability out there that you can get. You go through a process, you get a badge that tells the world that you're a good company, and they serve a purpose. It's predominantly marketing. I think they can sometimes be negative in terms of exactly what you said there, because what they tend to rely on is a periodic assessment of what you've done in the past. So first of all, you try and retrofit all your data to get that assessment. And then you don't have to do anything, or you have to do bits and bobs for 3 years. Now, all of them will tell you, it's about continuous improvement over those 3 years. But if you're only measuring things periodically, effectively, most of the time businesses will scramble around, get it, do very little until about 6 months before they need it again. Then they'll scramble around and get it again.
Sounds like university and exams.
Exactly. And it sounds like just about everything. All of us procrastinate. All of us do our best work about 2 hours before the deadline is due, because we've spent the last 2 weeks having a cup of coffee or procrastinating or playing Candy Crush or whatever it is that you do to distract yourself. And that's just human nature. The reason we've designed FuturePlus as it is it allows you to be honest when you benchmark where you are, because you still get credit on where you want to be. But it is a constant live real-time process. You set your objectives for 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, 3 years. And then over time, you're small bite-sized incremental pieces of change over that period. And that's, when I said at the very beginning, driving the incentives towards continuous improvement and not towards the periodic reporting of past action is so essential in achieving what you're talking about here, because it builds it in. You're thinking about it all the time, but it's also not daunting. It's not, in 3 years' time, I have to employ 5 consultants to do a huge piece of work. I have a little bit to do today and a little bit to do in a month. And, I can task these out. People just do little bits over time. But what that leads to is a far greater cumulative sort of effect and progress than just big chunks of work and then forgetting about it for a couple of years.
Or, this question really deserves its own episode, which we will do, but could you maybe say briefly where somebody can start if one of our listeners is hearing all of this and is like, yeah, okay, but what do I even do to begin?
Well, again, that's why we've designed our system as it is. It assumes no knowledge, and it allows you to benchmark where you are against all global frameworks, but then more importantly, allows you to set objectives to where you want to be. But in a more general sense, I would say to people, don't be afraid about it, but look at it in its broadest sense. Look at it in terms of your business operations. Just look at it in terms of efficiency and risk management, etc., and identify all the things that you could improve alongside all the things you've done in the past. People get so hung up on, have I done this? Have I done that? Doesn't matter. You either have or you haven't. It doesn't really matter at that point in time. Just consider it, see what you've done, but most importantly, whatever it is you've done, see how you can improve that over a period of time, and put in place manageable but continuous incremental processes. But there are systems like ours out there that will help guide you through that in a very inexpensive way. So I think don't be afraid to ask for assistance in it. Take it seriously. Some of the best organizations we work with are ones that hadn't particularly considered sustainability in the past, but they really grasped it. They created committees amongst the organization. They normalized the language within the whole organization and sort of dispersed action out. So it means everybody's bought in. And then that becomes a machine in itself that then continuously improves things. If you sort of, as you were sort of alluding to with the chief sustainability officer, put it in one office, give it one name and tell one person or 2 people that they're responsible for the whole organization, they're going to get overwhelmed and nobody else is going to change their practices. If it's about facilitating groups and whole communities of improvement within your organization, then it becomes normal. But it should be predominantly focused on what it is you think you can do better rather than what it is you have done in it.
Amazing. So encouraging. One final question, which again could open a whole can of worms. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you would like to add on this topic?
I think that there are a million things, but I think that the main one is, and again, this is my personal opinion, but I think we need to stop getting so hung up on specific terms and also a lot of the trends and how they're applied at the moment. It sounds very vague, but a good example for me, when I said earlier about diversity and inclusion, we conceptualize it very much in a way that we've been told we need to, and that legislation is dictated based on historic action. But some of the biggest problems we have at the moment is because we focused on diversity and not on inclusion. So, for example, and sometimes it's difficult to voice, but in a lot of Europe and the developed world at the moment, the most excluded groups are not the ones that you would initially think are the most excluded, but using conventional diversity thinking. So, for example, white working class men have the lowest educational and life outcome chances alongside one or two other demographics in a lot of the developed world at the moment. So what happens then, because we're still hung up on things being either related to gender or color or things like this, is we don't include them in that debate. And then what happens? What happens is Trump. What happens is Brexit. What happens is the riots we've seen on the streets, where nobody ever moves towards a problem when they're told that they are part of it. They move away from it. They find something else to align to. The same is happening with carbon emissions. When you're telling people that if you are not good with carbon now, you're bad, they won't move towards you. They'll move away. They'll say, well, I don't believe in it then. I don't think that this is correct. If the same thing is happening with socioeconomic factors. So I think it's follow the data, look at the actual underlying data that informs what it is we value and what it is we do. And however uncomfortable that might be, it's still the data, it's still correct. It's science. And I think sometimes the emotive language we use, a bit of the intellectual superiority sometimes that's applied to sustainability, the explicitness of it is stopping us addressing the real underlying causes of things, which is it's less and less a focus on diversity, it's more and more a focus on inclusion. It's less and less a focus on only reducing carbon emissions. It's a focus on what generally is the environmental footprint of your organization. How are you affecting biodiversity? How are you affecting your waste profile, your water profile? It's less just about what are the economic terms I'm giving my employees. It is how are those economic terms helping them socially in the environments in which they work. And I think the more you conceptualize things in terms of the impact you want to have based on the data in the environments in which you're operating, and less about this is what common convention tells me. But when it comes to all the things I've said, the more likely we are to create a better, more equitable, more environmentally sound society than one that is just conforming to whatever the trend of the day is today.
So again, it's a continuous work of continuous improvement, recording of data and analyzing the data.
And being honest in the analysis of data, I guess, is my point. If data is showing you something again and again, and it's you've collected it properly, then that is the truth, even if it confronts conventional dogma and conventional ideas. Follow the data, be honest with it, and have honest and transparent conversations with your stakeholders. And you'll have a much, much better, more trusted business in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike, for your time and knowledge today. It's really appreciated.
My absolute
I'm sure
pleasure.
our listeners will love it as well. And to you, our listeners, thank you so much for listening again. Don't forget to follow us on social media and why not subscribe to our newsletter as well. See you next week.